Well, a huge welcome. Today, we're going to talk about recycling adversity. And my guest today is someone who's become a friend, Sheridan Voysey, who's a radio personality and an author. Up on the screen, you'll see some of his books. And one of the books that we're going to refer to today, Sheridan, in just a moment, is The Making of Us, Who We Can Become When Life Doesn't Go as planned. We'll pick that up in just a moment. I thought you might like, folks, after Rick Thomas's great interview last week, you might like to see Jill's handiwork over Christmas. Here it comes on the screen. She found this design on Etsy and she began to cut it out on a little machine called a Cricut. Those of you who are interested, feel free to email her, harangue her for the details. It's time she got involved, I say. Talking about wives getting involved, Sheridan, your wife, Merrin, did I say that right? I did.
Mirren?
She's
That's
the lead statistician for the Oxford vaccine. I just wondered how long she's been working on that and how tough that's been for you both. That must be quite a deal.
It's been full on, Dave. Really has been. So she and the team would have been early March, maybe late February, started working on the vaccine. And Merrin's role has really been um, to shape the kind of data that they really needed, and so to shape the research project, and then to mine that data as it came in over time. And so
Long
they
hours?
have. Oh, just a little. I mean, there really wouldn't have been in 2020, there wouldn't have been more than a handful of weekends that Merrin had off. The
Wow.
rest were working sometimes all weekend, at least 1 or 1.5 days across the weekend, and long hours and long nights. And so it has been a full-on year, 2020. And but of course, as we speak now, things aren't necessarily slowing down. Thankfully, the vaccine is on its way out, and so it's going to be distributed very, very quickly. But there's more data to pull in, and how it's responding in different groups, and there's a lot more to do. So the project isn't over.
Ah, wonderful. Well, a big thanks to Maren from our viewers, I know from the Salt and Light family, which you and she are part of. Huge thank you. One member of my family was on the Oxford vaccine trial. Two members of my family have already had their jabs. So we're committed to the Oxford vaccine here.
Fabulous. So you don't believe the conspiracy theories, Dave? Well, I'm glad
Let's
to
not
hear.
go there. Let's
Let's
not
not go
go
there.
there. We'll leave that to Rick Thomas. By the way, folks, don't forget, a good number of you requested Rick's PDF. It's still available if you'd like that PDF on the vaccine that Rick's put together, Dr. Rick Thomas. Then just use the contact form on David Oliver Books and we'll get it to you. Sheridan, into today's context then, before we talk about recycling adversity, maybe even for you to segue yourself into it, tell us a little bit about your background as a radio personality and then what brought you to writing the book, Who We
Mm,
Can Become When Life Doesn't Go as Planned, The Making of Us.
yeah. Well, I never had any interest in getting into radio at all. So I became a Christian at the age of 17, 18. There were two or three moments there and some stops and starts. And then finally, I really kind of started walking with God around about the age of 19. But my background was in nightclubs. That was where I was hoping to find my life and my significance and make my mark. Became a Christian, prayed for 2 years to know what to do with my life, didn't have any direction until finally, in the space of like 2 or 3 days, it all came very clearly into view. And this is mentioned in The Making of Us, so I won't go into too much detail, but I had clear direction to go into radio and to go and be part of a Bible college that wasn't too far away from where I lived. So I went and did those two things. Always thought that I was going to work behind the scenes in radio. I was going to work in production, twiddling knobs. And then actually on the first day that I was meeting with the station manager, he said, "Well, you've got a good voice. Do you think, you should think about being on air?" What's the last thing that I wanted to do? I was happy to play music, mix music, cut music, do all those kinds of things. I wasn't interested at all about talking. And then that kind of flicked on a switch for me a few years in music radio. I really had a hunger for interviewing and for talk. And so ended up about good 10, 12 years later, moving to Sydney, starting up a national uh, talk based radio program called Open House, which explored life, faith, and culture, which was particularly aimed at the average secular Australian. And so we were talking about the things of Christian faith in a way that could try and make sense for those people who I would call them the everyday New Ager, the person who was reading a Deepak Chopra book, they were watching Oprah, they were reading The Secret and other books like that. They weren't quite into the crystals, but they were interested in spiritual things. And we had 5 years of me hosting that show. It lasted another 7 or 8 years after that. After which we then moved to the UK for very different reasons altogether. So during that 10 years when things were going so well for me in broadcasting and speaking, and I had books published, another dream we were pursuing that wasn't coming true, and that was the dream of having a family. And Dave, we pretty much tried everything to try and start that family. We tried IVF, we tried adoption, we did 8 months of assessment and then waited for 2 years for the phone call on the New South Wales adoption list. Phone call never came to come and pick up our little boy, little girl. We tried special diets. We even tried chiropractic, and to this day, I do not know why we thought that would work, but somebody told us chiropractic could work. We tried healing prayer numerous times. And would you believe at the end of that 10-year dream journey, we had pretty much given up any hope of hearing the news that we wanted, but we decided to try a few rounds of IVF, kind of our last ditch effort. And on the final embryo transfer of our final round, this is after 10 years, December of 2010, we had already decided this would be the end of the journey for us if it didn't work. On the final embryo transfer, we got a phone call from the IVF clinic saying that we were pregnant. And there was so much jubilation amongst our family and friends who had walked with us for a decade on this particular journey. And then on Christmas Eve of 2010, we received another phone call from the clinic saying, "We are so sorry, but you're not pregnant." And with that, Merrin put the phone down, walked into our bedroom, curled up in a fetal position on our bed. And that's where the dream ended. So she really only wanted to do one other thing apart from become a mum, and that was to live and work overseas. So when a little university, some people might have heard of it, called Oxford University, offered her a job, we saw that as the consolation prize she needed. And so we moved over here in 2011, but that meant me leaving the open house show, meant leaving the speaking opportunities, the book contracts. And so I found the first couple of years of being in the UK a complete unpicking of my identity, my sense of self, because I'd built for 10, 15 years by that stage, my identity as a writer, speaker, broadcaster. And then those doors weren't opening when I first came over here. And so ultimately that led to Resurrection Year, the first book telling our story of our journey through infertility, and then The Making of Us, which really looks at who can you become when life doesn't go as planned, when maybe you thought you knew who you were, maybe you had a settled sense of self, maybe you knew what your identity was and then you lost it. Who can you become then? That's really what the book tackles.
So Sheridan, that's intensely impacting. I'd like to come back in a moment to that particular moment, that Christmas Eve. But before I do that, just lessen the intensity just momentarily. What has become of your broadcasting here in the UK?
When I came to the UK, I met with a couple of Christian radio networks and we had a good chat, and I loved these people, but it just didn't feel right. In Australia, the Australian Christian radio scene has pioneered a form of broadcasting that you won't hear anywhere else. And it really is kind of that missional approach of trying to reach the mainstream Australian. I missed that. That's really what I'd been nurtured and discipled and built for. And there wasn't really that happening here. And so started knocking on the doors of the BBC. Of course, I didn't hear anything from them for a few years. And then after a number of people put my name forward, I received an email about doing some work for the Pause for Thought segment on BBC Radio 2. This is a spot that airs overnight and then at 5:45 and 9:20 in the morning on Radio 2. I started off doing the live.
Just give our overseas listeners, UK folks will immediately relate to that, but just maybe position it for Australia, for Americans and Canadians, what kind of broadcasting this is.
So BBC Radio 2 is Europe's largest broadcaster, 12 million listeners a week, about 9 of them at the moment in breakfast, listening in the breakfast show. They still have this little spot called Pause for Thought, which is kind of a God spot. Now, these days it's multi-faith, but you go in and you basically give a little kind of 2 to 3 minute God spot. It's scripted. It goes through several producers before you make it on air, but you go and you speak then with your little 3 minute spot to about 9 million people in breakfast.
Oh, cool.
So I may not be hosting the 3 hour show that I was doing before, but that had 100,000 listeners on a Sunday night, which for Australia was pretty good. I'm happy with 3 minutes speaking to 9 million people.
Yeah, it's great.
Works.
So, Sheridan, the book, tell us about that.
So the making of us is based on a pilgrimage that a friend and I did. And we did it from Lindisfarne in the north of England. So this is a little island just on the border between England and Scotland, considered one of the two birthplaces of Christianity in Britain. It really was a place from where the gospel finally, after already being here in Britain on the island, maybe for 100 or 200 years before, but it was when really the gospel really took root in the pagan soul, if you like, of Britain. We did a 116-mile, 140 odd kilometer walk south down to Durham over the period of about 8 days. And the making of us really recounts the conversations that my friend DJ and I have along those 8 days, the things that we see, the caves we go into where great saints used to pray, and the amazing experiences, the beauty we see, but particularly the conversations we have about identity and purpose after life hasn't gone as we planned. And then we arrive in Durham Cathedral for evensong, limp in there because we've got horrendous blisters, lots of pain. But then this incredible moment of serendipity happens, which kind of ends the book under I guess, a note of providence that, with all the difficulty, with all the loose ends, with all the things we don't quite understand, why we've experienced them, why we've gone through them, why God's allowed them, there is a sense in which God's providence is wrapping them all together into something beautiful.
So you can see up on screen, folks, the making of us, and we'll put up on screen where you can get copies of that book. But Sheridan, I'm pretty sure our viewers right now are desperate for me to take them back to Christmas Eve and to Marion curled up in a fetal position on that bed. The crashing down of her dreams and the apparent sequence in a process of answers crashing down yours. So, what are the lessons you two have learned that can help us, all of us coming out of COVID? But I suspect more than that, there'll be some watching this who have been through a similar journey, not had the dream of a family, but there'll be others with their own variation of dark times, tough times, broken dreams. Can you give us some keys then that help us take adversity and make something good of it?
Yeah. Well, therein lies the content of at least two books. I will say, particularly, let me just give a note for those people who are going through the specific challenge of childlessness, because it is a very unique challenge. The interesting thing about writing Resurrection Year and then The Making of Us was that in talking about our specific story, it actually echoed far beyond the specific experience we had of childlessness into so many other broken dreams, whether that was the broken dream of a marriage that never came about, Mr. or Mrs. Right never came along, or a divorce, or the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a career, or the never gaining of a career, an art career that never took off, all of those kinds of things. But specifically to the person who's wrestling with childlessness, the great challenge, if you're going through that time, is never knowing when to stop. Because like any other loss, it's made for you. The decision is made for you. And with childlessness, until menopause hits or something else, you have to make a decision as to when you will keep on going with this journey or whether you will stop it. And that's the hardest thing I've found for couples. Look, statistically, most couples get some child in the end. They either, IVF works, or God does a miracle, answer to prayer, or the adoption comes through. Adoption and fostering are different here in the UK, so I really would suggest that people pursue that because there's lots of kids waiting to be fostered. But there is a small percentage of people like ourselves for whom nothing works. And this is the most difficult thing, is how do you move on when there has been no end given to you? And so you have to work out how to draw a line yourself. You have to work out how to bring that dream to an end and actually bury it. This is a hard thing to say, but you cannot move on until you've been able to bring an end to it. Otherwise, what you have, and we speak to couples like this all the time, is for whom the issue of children is still in the back of their mind and they can never move on. And so we suggest that you don't know when the right time is. I always suggest that people pursue every angle and every avenue that they feel comfortable pursuing before they make that decision. Or they just simply get to a point where the marriage is being destroyed by it or something. Well, that's a good reason to at least pause the journey. But then there is a time in which you have to do something very physical, very practical, very definite that says, okay, we're going to draw a line in the sand and we're going to move on with our lives as a childless couple. For one couple, it was quite literally walking down to the beach, drawing a line on the sand, praying and saying, okay, we're now going to step over this line and we're moving from the couple who has tried so hard to have children to now the couple who is moving on as a childless couple. For others, it's writing a piece of paper, their dream or something, and kind of casting it to the air. But there is some sort of physical, practical way that you do that. For us, that phone call was kind of the line that had been drawn for us because we'd already made the decision. If this doesn't work, we're then moving on. So
Sure.
that's a little bit of help
Can
just
I
for that
just
one.
pause there for a moment, Sheridan? I'm very aware that this could have stirred one or two at a very deep level. Is there anything we can offer in terms of support or resource where they could go to after this broadcast?
Yeah, well, Resurrection Year, the book, will give you a whole heap of companionship. That's actually the biggest thing that you need, is actually just to know that you are not
I'll
alone
put
in this.
that up on screen. What's the title again, please?
Resurrection Year. So that's our story, so that
Yeah,
you just know that you're not alone. That's the key.
yeah.
Number two, there is a wonderful blog called Saltwater and Honey. And if you just Google that, it'll be the first thing that comes up, probably. Saltwater and Honey. That's a Christian community made up of about 2 to 3 couples, Christian couples, who all found themselves wrestling in this area. And they have then gone and mined their experience to be able to share all sorts of lessons and again give some comradeship to people who are going through this as well. There in the UK, there is Infertility Network. There would be the similar equivalent organization in the United States. And I can't remember what it's called in Australia, but if you were to do that too, you will find a kind of a supportive network of people.
Brilliant. So if you missed that, folks, use the contact form, David Oliver Books, and I'll make sure we get you the content. We've just popped it up on screen, as you've seen, and that's where you can access it. Thanks for that, Sheridan. So let's think then about all of us. COVID has impacted all of us in a whole variety of ways, some more painfully, perhaps more dark than for others. What kind of tips can you give us that will help us take this unprecedented year, as everybody keeps telling us, and turn it into something unprecedentedly good?
Yeah. First thing I would say is don't rush it and don't push it. There is a time to heal. And the last thing that Marin and I needed to do when, in the kind of weeks after we had that phone call on Christmas Eve, was to start talking about how we're going to recycle this into something good. There is a period of healing that has to happen first, and that includes rest, renewal, and then in time, a certain degree of thinking about reinvention. So have some rest, have some renewal, because no doubt your trial will have probably raised questions or at least disrupted perhaps your relationship with God. And then there is a time of starting to think about kind of reinvention. But when it comes to this whole aspect of adversity, this has become then a calling for me in many ways, Dave. The unexpected calling. is that in going public with our story and that it resonating with so many people who have gone through their own difficulties as well, we've heard from so many people, we've gone and mined this, and we've been able to find that there are some things that then you can do. Number one, tend your soul. We are going through, let's use COVID as an example then. We are going through some incredibly trial testing times for us. For some of us, it's really hitting mental health. For others, we might be losing our jobs. We might be losing our roles in the community. Simply being isolated from other people can affect our sense of well-being, maybe even our sense of identity. Tend your soul. Keep up with prayer. Maybe you want to explore some different kinds of prayer, like breath prayer. I've got a breath prayer that we could put up into your notes as well that's been particularly helpful for people during this lockdown period. It's based on Galatians 5, where we receive, we don't ask for anything as much as we receive from the Holy Spirit love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and long suffering. All of those good qualities that we need during this time. So tend your soul. That might be getting out into nature. Research has found that if you contemplate nature for as little as 20 seconds a day, it's even better if it's 2 minutes or 10 minutes, but 20 seconds a day, you find that it increases well-being, decreases anxiety, and also has an interesting effect. It gives you a greater love for other people and a greater concern for the environment. So just contemplating nature, and I think that's Romans 1:20 in effect, that if we contemplate nature, we glimpse something of God's creative power and nature coming through there. It might be doing other things like doing a project, getting creative. I believe there is such a thing as a spiritual practice of play. I think we actually need to incorporate play as a spiritual practice. As we play, we glimpse a timeless world. We glimpse something of what heaven will be like. And I've heard of another author who's on this call right now who's written a book about heaven. But, there's been great sociologists, that have looked at this and said, when we play, we enter this timeless experience. For me, it's photography. I lose all track when I'm doing photography. For somebody else, it'll be sport. And you just lose all sense of time and you enter a sense of flow. And all of those things give us a glimpse of what a new creation might be like. So tend your soul would be the first thing.
Let me just interject there then, Sheridan, and I'm going to give you a challenge, but I'm going to give you 30 seconds to prepare yourself. I'm going to get you to do a breath prayer for us. Mm-hmm. Just demonstrate it. And while Sheridan is thinking about that, you'll remember Lynn Jones folks taught us how Thanksgiving for a minute or more reshapes the brain, reinvigorates well-being, and makes a hormonal and neuro-linguistic difference. That's another tending of the soul. And interestingly, Sheridan has just mentioned play. Our very next interview is with Tracy Spears, an author who has done a beautiful devotional book, which will help you tend your soul, by the way. And we'll look at that in our next broadcast. But she's just starting a PhD on the impact of play. So there we go, a great segue into the next broadcast. But Sheridan, take us through a breath prayer, no pressure.
Well, look, let me lead you through this one that I've written on Galatians 5, because it has proven to help a lot of people over these last 10, 11, 12 months. It's based on Galatians 5. And what does the Apostle Paul start it off with saying? He starts it off by saying, be filled with the Holy Spirit. And so we are asking God to fill us with his Holy Spirit. But with the Holy Spirit comes all of these wonderful virtues that help us to stay sane, virtues that help us to reach out and love other people when we actually don't have a lot of energy to do that. So I've coupled these with kind of their antecedent. So something to let go of as well as something to receive. So I would just simply start by just being quiet and focusing on God, and then just praying with a rhythm of breathing in and breathing out, breathing in the good things that he wants to give us, and breathing out the bad things he wants to let go of. And so when it comes to this particular breath prayer from Galatians 5, we say, well, Lord, I receive your love, and I release my insecurity. I receive your joy, and I release my unhappiness. I receive your peace, and I release my anxiety. I receive your patience, and I release my impulsiveness. I receive your kindness, and release my indifference. I receive your goodness, and release my ungodliness. I receive your faithfulness, and release my disloyalty. I receive your gentleness, and release my severity. And I receive your self-control, and I release my self-indulgence. Now, it is quite profound what happens when you just kind of rest with that and maybe start your day with it or end your day with it. I've pierced it into the middle of my day when I've kind of needed, more of those qualities to just receive from God, receive from the Spirit, all of those virtues that we need to get through.
It's wonderful. So, folks, I'm going to encourage you. It might have caught you out, as it may have caught Sheridan out when I asked him originally. That was wonderful. And it was real, authentic. So, I'm going to encourage you, if you didn't quite experience it, or even if you did and you'd like to give it another go, just rewind in a minute. Take some time out, play it through a couple of times, and let the Spirit and the Word of God do their work. Sheridan, tend to our soul. Come on, what else can we do? Feeling ready for it. What are you going to give me next?
Mine the experience, mine it. So here's what I've learnt is that all of these trials and difficulties that we're going through are gold. So there was a time I was talking with somebody who many of our viewers may well know, Adrian Plass, who's a wonderful British author. And Resurrection Year came about because out of the blue, he said, have you thought about writing your story into a book? And Dave, it was furthest thing from my mind. I had not even contemplated the idea that our story would be something worth sharing, because I had dreams of other books and I was kind of thinking over there and looking over here. If you want to use a metaphor, I was looking for the diamonds beyond the hills, and he showed me actually I was standing on gold right where I was. And there is something about mining our experience, dredging up that gold, that we're then able to offer it to other people. One of the greatest tools for doing this is a cheap A5 spiral bound notepad, which I call my journal. Now, I've got kind of rows and rows of these going back 15, 20 years. I don't spend a lot of money on these. They've got to be hardcover. They've got to be spiral bound. All I do is I record my highs, my lows, my questions, and my discoveries into my journal. Now, the first thing that normally comes to people's minds, at least my experience is when we start talking about journal, is people say, oh, I tried that once, but I couldn't keep it up. And then I say, well, what do you mean keep it up? And they said, well, you're supposed to do it every day, aren't you? And I say, no, I will go months without writing anything in my journal. And other weeks I'll be writing everything every day because there's so much going on. It is your servant, it is not your master. But what happened when I took that idea from Adrian Plass to write Resurrection Year is I went back and I read 10 years of journals. And I was able to piece together a whole bunch of lessons, a whole bunch of things that I was wrestling with sometimes for years that finally started to connect, and the dots seemed to join up, and I started to see a picture which maybe I hadn't seen before. It's the amazing thing about a journal is it can objectify the difficult experience that you're going through. Once you've kind of written it down, it somehow gets it off the heart, gets it onto the page. You can kind of look at it even within the same day and start to get some insight into it, start to reflect on it. The Apostle Paul told Timothy, reflect on what I'm saying, and the Lord will give you insight. And I love that phrase. There is something powerful about prayerful reflection. Now, in his case, he didn't even realize it, but he was giving scripture to Timothy. But ultimately, at the time, he just thought he was giving good advice. Uh, Reflect on what I'm saying, Timothy, and the Lord will give you insight. So there's something powerful about prayerful reflection on our experiences, the teaching of others, conversations we have with people like Adrian Plass, other people who come along our lives, the video you're watching right now, listening to Dave's wisdom. All of those things, when we reflect on them, we somehow are able to hold them in a space. And then over time, they start to be like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, start to make up a whole picture. We start to see our lives in a way that we didn't before. Then you can mine those lessons. I speak to a lot of people who would love to write books. And sometimes what they haven't done is done the hard work of reflection. They have got an experience and they want to go and share it with everybody else, but maybe they're still working through it. Maybe they're still in an anger stage. I've read a lot of manuscripts of people who are still in the anger stage, or still in the kind of wrestling stage. Now, there's a real gift in being vulnerable and authentic with where you are at the time. But ultimately, you want to share something of what you've discovered and learned that can be helpful for other people, that can be universal, not just simply helpful for you too. And that just takes time, it takes reflection, it takes talking it through with other people, it takes further research and reflection at a maybe a little bit more academic level, just to work out what is helpful for other people. But mine your experience. You're going through some incredible things right now. This is one of the main ways that God is shaping you to be the person he wants you to be. And there will be some lessons that you can share with other people through that.
That's so helpful. Somebody shared with me ages ago in this context, and I found it so helpful. He said, view those thoughts as seeds, and they need planting. And planting is mining in your metaphor there is write them down. Some seeds germinate, some seeds die. That's the nature of seeds. But if they're not planted, they never germinate.
Right.
I think that's really powerful, really
Yeah.
powerful. And just as you were talking, then I was reminded of that amazing little verse that comes out of nowhere. I think it's in Chronicles, and David says, all this I have in writing with the hand of the Lord upon me. It's almost like there's this moment where pen in hand touches paper at that tactile moment where, just like your breath prayer, somehow the spirit latches on or empowers or impregnates. Anyway, what's number 3? You've given us 2.
I'll be looking up that verse in Chronicles, wherever it is. That's great. Third point I would suggest would be treat your problem as a quest. Approach it as a quest. I was speaking at Spring Harvest once, and afterwards, a lady and her daughter came up to me to speak. And the daughter would have been in her mid to late 30s. She was crying, really wasn't in a place to be able to talk. So her mother started speaking for her, and she said, I'll call her Samantha. We've both been very touched by what you've shared today. And Samantha has a question for you, but I'll speak on her behalf. A few months ago, Samantha's husband was arrested on some very serious charges to do with children. Since then, Samantha has lost not just her husband, but her daughter, who thinks that she was somehow complicit in it, all her friends, and everybody else around her. Here's our question, Sheridan. What new beginning could come from this? Now, here's where we started off, Dave, is that the last thing people going through that kind of depth of darkness, the last thing that they need is me to come and sprout off a whole bunch of platitudes. That somehow this can be, turned into something good, or we can look at the bright side or the positive side, or the silver lining on the dark cloud. All of those metaphors, that can sometimes be so hard when we're in the midst of such a dark time. So I started praying like crazy in the back of my mind, and I used my question tactic to buy myself some time before I responded. So I said, well, Samantha, tell me a little bit more about your story and your experience. And so she shared a little bit. And then just as she was speaking, something it was nebulous. It was starting to form there in the back of the mind. And then it was starting to get clearer and clearer and started to crystallize. And I said, Samantha, the sense of trust being broken for you must be immense. I said, your husband broke your trust. Your friends has broken your trust. And she said, my church has broken my trust too. They haven't known how to deal with this. And so they've left me to fend for myself. And that's when it finally became crystallized. I said, okay, Samantha, how about this? How about if you were to approach this horrendous breach of trust, and if you were to approach this as a quest, and if you were to take this on as a mission to find out how to rebuild trust in other human beings again when it has been so badly broken. Just say you were to go on that and take as long as it takes to rebuild trust in humanity again. Just say you were to journal the highs and the lows and the questions and the discoveries and the setbacks and the lessons you learn along the way. Then you could have something quite powerful to share with other people who have gone through their own betrayals of trust. And for the first time, Samantha looked up, wiped away her tears, looked at her mum. Her mum looked at her. They looked at each other. She said, yeah, you know, I think I could do that. There is something about approaching the trial that we go through as a quest. There is something about we somehow swap positions because suddenly we're not kind of at the mercy of the trial that we're going through. Somehow we're kind of starting to transcend it, and it's starting to become our servant rather than us be kind of the servant of it, being driven by it, being kind of crushed by it. We somehow kind of step up above that, and to be able to say, you know what, this in the name of Christ can actually be recycled into something of value, not just for myself, but also for somebody else. That is quite powerful.
So, can you help us? I'm aware that hundreds of different people, different circumstances, but all of us impacted by COVID. Give us a kind of direction or a question to ask ourselves or a way of approaching this that would help us relate this to our last 9 months and probably the coming 3 to 6 months of COVID.
Okay, so if you're a parent and suddenly you have found yourself yet again going through the process of working out, are your kids going to school tomorrow or what? And then suddenly you're in a position of homeschooling. And on top of that, then also you're having to think about, well, working from home because now you have to be fully isolated. So all of those things can be overwhelming, and we have to accept that and actually have to embrace that sense of overwhelm. If we try and fight it, that doesn't really help. But if we accept that for a little while and then say, okay, right, we're going to treat this as a quest. We are going to learn how to be really good homeschoolers to the best of our ability in this season. I'm going to learn how to do my job in this arrangement. And it's going to require new skills, and it's going to require different approach. And it's going to require actually, for a period of time, me reducing my expectations of productivity. But I'm going to treat it as a quest rather than something that is horrible. I hate it and I have to respond to. I'm going to rise to this challenge and I'm going to turn it into a mission. I'm going to learn from that mission. I'm going to grow from that mission. And in fact, I might even be able to help other people as a result of doing this mission. For me, one example of that was moving to doing online retreats. So, like you, like many other people, uh, from March 2020, all of my speaking, including 2 or 3 international trips, were all cancelled. And so, very quickly, I had to kind of pivot and then kind of learn to do things like this. That has been an immense skill that I've been able to take on as well. And it has resulted in all kinds of new audiences being reached and new things that I never would have done before, which have been very fruitful. And some haven't, but there's been a lot of growth and a lot of change, which I've then been able to pass on to other people as well. That's just one example. But it's an attitude thing. We're going to rise to this and we're going to treat it as something that we are going to.
That's really helpful. I'm wondering, folks, remembering back to our 5 a day to keep COVID at bay, as Sheridan's been talking. I don't know if it's gone through your mind, folks, but what's gone through mine is reach out and make a difference, 2 of the 5. And there's something about a quest, which is not about what it does to me, but what's being done in me for others. And maybe that will just help the trajectory of thinking. I love that verse where Paul says somewhere, God has comforted you in your affliction, so you can comfort others with any affliction, with the comfort that you've been comforted with. That's true, what's the word, leverage. Wonderful, positive leverage. I'm mindful of the time, Sheridan, but mindful I don't want to miss point 4, which you mentioned off camera. Take us to point 4.
Well, in relation to all of that, consider marrying this trial with your talent. So we are going through a difficult time. That's a trial. You have been given spiritual gifts and talents by God, and He's used all sorts of providential ways to nurture and shape those. It's when you bring those two together that there is real power. So we can take a lesson from the art world. Degas was a brilliant artist, but over the last 50 years of his life, his eyesight was damaged horrendously. He had significant retina damage. He had to move from painting to pastels because the thicker lines were easier for his eyes to see. Renoir was crippled with rheumatoid arthritis to the point where he wasn't able to hold a brush anymore. It had to be placed into his kind of gnarled, kind of claw-like hands so that he could brush. We've had many artists for whom these kinds of setbacks have happened. You kind of think, well, as an artist, that's it. That's the end. If you can't see, if you can't actually hold a brush, what's going to happen? Actually, in these cases, new artistic breakthroughs happened. So this is where Degas brought out some of his best work, his Blue Dancers series. And for Renoir, it resulted in a whole heap of new artworks, which were a lot softer as a result of the different way that he held his brush. His trial and his talent were melded together to actually birth something, and here's the key point, that wouldn't otherwise have been birthed. So there's something about kind of using our talents, might be artistic or pastoral or prophetic or leadership talents or whatever it might be. There is something about having a trial. There is an X factor that is released when these two come together. We've seen this with Christian ministries in the past. Think of Charles Colson going to prison for his part in the Watergate scandal back in the early 70s. Becomes a Christian in prison. The result is him combining his trial, in this case because of his own sinful actions, with his leadership abilities to found Prison Fellowship, which has then gone on to touch prisoners and the victims of crime and their families and so many other people, transformed whole prison blocks as a result of the birth of Prison Fellowship. Johnny Erickson Tada, woman who lost the use of all of her limbs as a result of a diving accident. The result of her combining that trial with her encouraging gift is the birth of Johnny and Friends, which I think is still the largest organization of its kind reaching people with disabilities around the world. So something that could not otherwise come into the world happens when the trial is combined with the gift. What are your spiritual gifts? What are your talents? What are your strengths? What's your trial? Mine it for its emotions and its lessons and its difficulties and all of its new learnings that you're finding. Bring those two together. Don't rush it. Then just see what might happen as a result of God merging those two things together.
That's been so incredibly helpful and practical, Sheridan. Thank you so much. Folks, tend to your soul, mine the experience, gather seeds, plant them in a journal. Turn the problem into a quest and marry that quest to your gifts and talents. One more question in just a moment, Sheridan, and that is give you a moment to think about it. What about folks that really struggle to know or believe in what their gifts and talents are? So while you're thinking about that, let me just say again, because I think it's really helpful with those 4 practical sequential steps, that it's not about me, it's about what God's doing in me for others, that the horizon begins to open in ever expanding measure in front of us. But help us then with that one last question, Sheridan, if you would. What if I don't know what my gift and talent is?
Mm. There are lots of online assessment tools now, and some of them are free. I would suggest doing a couple of them because they have their own biases, and so do a couple of them. I run an online retreat a couple of times a year, and one of those components is I get people to go and do one of these, at least one, if not two, of these online gifts inventories. They are not to be taken as gospel. They are to be taken as a starting point, a pointer as to what your spiritual gifts might be. And they focus on the Romans 12 list of gifts. So take a look at those and just also pray. Do I have the gift of administration, or is it a prophetic gift or a pastoral gift, or what is it? Is it an encouraging gift? Is it a teaching gift? Secondly, I would then say the most important thing is ask a group of maybe 6 people around you to let you know how they experience you and how they have grown as a result of rubbing up against you. This is one of the best ways to do it. It can be done formally. I once had a mentor some years ago actually send out letters to 6 or 7 people that I'd asked to give them honest feedback, on me, went to him first so that they didn't feel that it was going to be, in some way damaging my friendship if they talked about my weaknesses as well, which is also really important. But then also it gave feedback. And when all of them independently started talking about, well, he's a good communicator and he's encouraging and he's a teacher and he's those things, well, then you listen to those. So listen to what people experience of you and how they grow. Is there a case in which when they meet with you, they come away encouraged? I've got a wind in my sails, breath in my lungs again to go and face the world. Or is it they learn something? Because somehow you always seem to think of some sort of principle and I just kind of take that and grab it? Or do I find myself wanting to be more organized or something? All of those are hints as to what your talents are. So there's 2 simple ways that you could
That's
go.
fantastic. And folks, we'll put those online resources up on screen in just a moment. I love the idea of asking 6 other people how they experience you. I was in a business setting probably about a year ago, and somebody actually got about 10 of us around the table to write one sentence, not quite using the same words, but how we experience the other person around the table. So it was folded over a bit like that game Consequences, where you turn the page over so you couldn't see what the other person had written. And I tell you what, at the end, I think there were 2 people, when I say in tears, I don't mean sobbing, but tears.
Wow.
Just as they touch something of God's gift
Yeah.
in them. Sheridan Voysey, it's been fantastic. Thank you. We will tend our soul. We'll mind the experience. We'll turn the adversity into a quest, and we'll try and marry it with who God's made us to be, remembering that it's not about what's in it for us, but what's in us for others. Take care, everybody, and a big thank you, Sheridan, for joining us. The next broadcast, by the way, will be with 2 ladies. You're going to love them, but Tracy Spears is an artist, an outstanding artist, written the most exciting and encouraging devotional book you've ever seen. You're going to see it on the next video. Take care, everybody.